Hey, it's Joe from So Much Monsters. Here we are with step 2 in the process of getting a game resolution model for games. So there's only going to be 4 steps, overarching steps here. The first one's going to be setup, and I'm going to show you how to cleanly break down your model, how to get it into Zbrush, and what to do to get it there correctly. We're going to show you the use of storing morph targets in order to do a damage layer and then bring it back to a more sane state. And then I'll do a quick little sculpt over on the rest of the model so we have some data for everything, all the rest of the character. Weapon. Thingy. Let's get into it. We're going to start out with the model we built last time. We have it now split up into 3 sections. You'll see I have one for the blade, name it, one for the handguard, nice naming, and one for the handle. I've sent these over to Zbrush. You'll see that I've started out with some subdivisions on. I have 4 iterations on the blade, 4 on the handle, and 4 on the guard. This is so that when we do subdivide in Zbrush, we don't get the destructive nature of Zbrush wrecking our model. So if you look at this guy, oops, hide unselected, you can see this is actually uncapped. And when I subdivide that, if it's at a low poly, it will just shrink way down. So what we want to do is just give it a place to start, and our start point is going to be with a bunch of subdivisions. So just go Z them over to our Zbrush. All right, so I'm just going to go straight into this. I'm going to duplicate my sword blade. Duplicate. We're going to keep one that is the original mesh just in here, and this will be for us to go back to our subdivided state and use it to reproject some detail back in. But for the second one, I'm going to go down to geometry. I'm going to say Dynamesh 128 is going to be fine for resolution, and I will let it project after it dynameshes. And so what this will do is just give us basically a sock version of our model that will have equidistant verts, so we'll have polygons distributed nicely over the surface. And when we zoom in, you'll be able to see that we can get equal amount of sculpting on all the parts, including the blade and the edges. On this model, if you look at it, the long polygons are going to make it really impossible to sculpt on when we go up higher. So I'm going to subdivide that one more time, 2 more times. And then I'm going to go here to our Dynamesh model, and I'm going to subdivide this 1, 2, 3. That's probably, let's see, what is he at? 8 million? That seems fine. So there's our subdivided blade. This is just a blade, but you can see all of this is going to be able to sculpt. You'll be able to sculpt equally over the whole thing. I'm going to unhide the original blade. That's going to have all of the form that I want to keep. And I'm going to say project all. And I should be able to do this by default. Since my model is based on it already, it should get most of it. If it doesn't, we can manually project some of it. Alright, so we've got it projected now, and what we can do is actually just take a look at our model. Take a peek here, you can see I can do pretty much whatever I want to it, but we still have nice clean surface in there. Nice and clean. We want to make sure that we are working towards the right goal, but since we have our original model still in here, we can always project back. So this I'm going to name Sculpt Blade. Original blade. So grab our Sculpt Blade and take a peek, make sure it's the right one. We're good. And I'm just going to go ahead and beat this up. Add a layer. This will be where I do all my damage. I will also store a morph target, which will be used later for returning back to a more reasonable model. We'll get probably just use clay tubes. For now, we can give it an alpha that is square. Start with just some pox. This portion is really simple. All we really want is some layered effects there. Keep in mind we have this on a layer in ZBrush, so when we go in at the end of this, we can actually change the intensity of it and bring it back towards 0 if we want to. But really it's just kind of a more random pocking or heavy damage on this layer. But it should be pretty straightforward. You can see I'm using that clay tubes to just cut away a few different layers, and that's it. Okay, so we've done one layer that is just beating it up that way. We can actually also just go step in and use the orb cracks or Damien Standard and just do a set of creases. We're going to use Lazy Mouse, and kittens are helping me. Hey, we should get out of there. Troublemakers. So we're going to use the orb cracks to just start cutting it up. This is going to look a little bit too procedural when I do this, but it's not going to be a big deal because what's going to end up happening is I'm going to take that stored morph target of the simplified clean model and I'm going to beat it back way back. So we go too far to get as much damage as we can in the first run, and it can be really sloppy this way. And then we can come back and be more sane about how it's done. So I'm actually going to just, right here, I'm just going to start doing some scratches that are going to go way overboard and be varying levels. So there'll be some really deep gouges, and then there'll be some real thin creases like this. And when we bring it back from the morphed version, it'll look nice and reasonable. Alright, well, back to fast forwarding. So this will look basically like a total shit show. Get a good amount of coverage on it so that once you start evaluating your model to see which parts need more detail and which parts are kind of covered, or also places where you need to put kittens that are burping, you can actually use the data that you've actually dug up and find happy accidents and intersections and where different forms are fighting over each other. So yeah, I mean, there's not a whole lot of rhyme or reason here. Just imagine this thing has been through the most hell you could possibly put a sword through. We really don't want this to be super damaged in the end. We are going to kind of bring it back way back by the end of this and save it in a way that we'll actually be able to use further reduction of the amount of damage if once we render it's too much. Now we're at a point where we can start beating back the detail, and we're going to keep this layer visible when we do it. So basically what we'll have is a blank model. Once we turn it off, the original state will be there. If we want to add any detail or clean up anything, we're welcome to do it, but we'll be able to turn on and off our damage layer whenever we want. So in order to do this, all we have to do, actually, since we stored that morph target at the beginning, is use the Morphe Brush, which is all it's going to do is change the state, and my phone rings. So we can actually start with the beating back of the detail now that we've got a pass over the whole thing. And because we stored the morph target, we'll have a base that will have our original model. If we turn off record and then unhide or unshow, you'll see we're back to default state. And this is what we'd be morphing back to. Basically, it'll compare the two states and morph it back based on intensity, 0 to 100, towards that. So we can actually slowly go back towards it now. So turn back on your layer. I'm going to turn on the record button. And I'm also making sure that when I do this, all the stuff that I've sculpted here is kind of irrelevant to me. So what I really want is for my brush itself to be bringing me back to a state that I actually like and I want to use later. So I'm going to use the Morphe Brush, but I'm going to turn on an alpha. We'll just use some random, let's see, I don't actually have any loaded right now. This is probably fine. And we'll do alpha spray to bring it back. And this should bring back in, maybe that's a little too much. Let's do that last. So let's first go back over without an alpha on. We'll turn alpha off. And obviously some of these big ridges they've got to go. We can leave a little bit of that surface undulation there, so it looks like dents. As you can see, I can actually just use a big clean brush, sculpt around it, and bring back some of that stuff. You'll note that it's going to stop at the 0 point, which is the Morphe version. But what it does let me do is I can actually inflate negatively. So it just basically says, hey, if I was going this direction on this vert, I'll continue that direction, so I can do the same thing here, push it away, kind of corrode it if I wanted to. But not what I'm interested in. I'm just going to bring this back a little bit. We will use that square alpha with spray. Bring this stuff back. And I did actually, so one thing we've done here is we've actually got a really consistent amount of detail, which is bad. So let's go for the long view, and I'm going to go and turn off that spray. I'm just going to use a regular brush, just dots, and I'm going to sort of long view push away some of this stuff. So we don't need quite as much grit. This isn't a post-apocalyptic sword, it's just we want to have that wear and tear to make it look believable. So let's bring back parts of it. You can see I can bring it back at whatever angles I want. I can kind of bring back in the center of this to have just little tiny chips there. And then on these cracks, you see how even they are. That's actually kind of lame. So let's also pull a little bit from the edges and make them a little bit less even. This isn't about making a perfect representation of how a scratch would happen on a sword. What it's doing is giving us a basis for information we can use in our normal map. So we don't want perfect. This isn't, like I said, it's not photoreal here. We want to get a representation of what we think a scratch might look like. So you can see I'm cutting back on these, and I'll change the shape of that a little bit. So you can kind of see what's happening there. So yeah, I'm gonna long view kind of bring back some areas where I've gone a little too crazy. We don't want such a consistent amount of coverage. It should look organic and interesting, but it shouldn't look like I just procedurally did all this stuff, which is kind of what happened when I went all crazy with it. So things like this, we can actually take these little scratches and get rid of their intersections, let them still exist, but just at a lower frequency. So yeah, let's hit the fast forward again. So yeah, just using that same brush as we've been before. We can also modify it, do like a spray, get a little bit more organic kind of spatter effect to it. When we kind of break it down like this, you can see it starts to give those scratches a little bit more life than the default state where they're just that wedge shape. Kind of makes it look a little bit more aged, a little bit more corroded. Now, this isn't something you have to do on every model, but definitely this kind of level of detail is something to kind of think about, especially if you want the specularity to dance nicely across the surface. So we get that flat plane that's perturbed a little bit by that scratch, so the specularity will kind of kick left and right a little bit. But certainly the amount that's here is just way too even, way too repetitive, somewhat like me doing tutorials. So just bringing it back to this much cleaner, much more sane level. With intentions, we can always scale back in our layer. We can just change the intensity there to almost nothing. So just so that this is a little bit more realistic looking. So yeah, the Morphe brush can be using any alpha we want. You don't actually have to use the brushes that I use to build the scratches. I mean, it could be literally any brush that you wanted. If you want to make a snake hook damage layer, then by all means, go on with your bad self, get your snake hook on. But personally, think that's kind of faux pas. Really, the end result is going to be beating it up so that we can kind of bring it back to a nice, reasonable level. We're going to have this morph target stored, so we can stop right where we are, take a look at what happens with this, and even if we render it down and it's too much, which honestly, like right now, it's a little much, we can definitely beat it back a little bit more. This area is going to end up looking substantially nicer than if you just straight render it. It will have the same nice roll-off that we got from hard surface modeling it. You get this nice shape from the blade, but then we'll get some nicks and dings and make the specularity much more interesting based on the scratches and wear and tear that's existing on the model. But yeah, so since we're saving all that, we actually get quite a bit of lenience in how the end result actually is represented. The low poly isn't going to be any different for the dings and scratches, so I can actually be pretty comfortable with saying, all right, this is enough for the blade itself to go on to the next portions of the model. And once we step away from the blade, we can actually see, the results. The results of our work. I only did one side, but the other side should be. I'll have it mirrored anyway. I'll only be rendering the top side of the model, and it will be mirrored to the back because it's wasteful to not do that. So let's take a peek with the other bits of the model. Hide the sword. So we've got a pretty good start. Realize it's a little bit hard to see that from here, but you'll understand once we start working through the other parts. So that's it, really. It's just a matter of picking out forms in scratches and dings and dents. That makes sense. You can see I've nicked up the corners a little bit, so make it an interesting rendered in normal. We can also go over this with a texture, just a grit texture. In this particular case, since this is a pretty straightforward, simple mesh, I am going to only do that in Crazy Bump. It's a really, really simple metal texture that I want to put just on the surface. So I'll do that once I get to the rendered out low poly. But that's it. So we'll go back to our fast forward and build out the rest of the model. Now, the rest of this model is going to have pretty much the same process as the original blade. I'm going to duplicate the model, I'm going to dynamesh it, I'll reproject it so that I get that equidistant set of verts so we can sculpt anything we want over the form. I am going to phone in the design a little bit, as this particular video I wanted to be quick, so normally I would go through and do a pass before I get to this damaged state and add inlays and various trims and stuff like that. This model was pretty simple the way that it was designed, so I just added a little bit of real quick hammered metal. Honestly, this is bullshit. Feel free to call me on it, but we want to get through the whole process, so I want you guys to see me render it and everything. So in the interest of me being sane and editing a video, I will do the least common denominator here. So just doing some basic sculpting, some trim, I was using H-polish to kind of dig out a little bit, some nonsense little sunburst pattern here. Making this asymmetrical in a minute here so that I can actually, basically once I've done the symmetry to the point where it looks respectable, turn off the symmetry itself to make it, in this case, since I'm going to do one half of the model, I can get away with just last moment doing asymmetry. That is something that you can do and should do anytime you have the opportunity. If you have symmetry, you can work way faster and build through most of your model real quick. So if you're doing a character and you've got that high quality scar right across the eyeball, that every villain seems to have if you're a Star Wars video game character, that you would obviously want to do the full sculpt of the face with symmetry on until the very last moment. When you get to that last moment, you add the scar, detail it up, maybe pose the face a little bit, you'll be straight. So, symmetry at the last moment. You can see I'm spending a little bit of time, Lord knows what. I have no idea what I'm doing here. Looks like I'm just reprojecting and failing at it. That's nice. Cool. So, science is not an exact science. I'm going to do a little mask here to do the leather strip. I would definitely do this as a model if I had a moment to do it. Just didn't have enough time here. So basically painting on where I want the recess to be, so it looks like it's wrapped leather around the base, or around the handle there. And so I make that mask, and then I will probably just do a deformation. We'll do a negative inflate on this. You can see that goes at that depth. And do some cutting across it. That's really it. So the final little step will be making a set of alphas to go right over the top of the model. And once it's on top of once I draw in the alpha, you'll see I'll drag a pattern over the whole thing, and then I'll start using the clay brush at a low intensity to build the pattern into what's there. So I'll test a couple things out, and then once we get to this last little second here, you see me do drag rectangles of a scaly skin leather sort of pattern. And first I guess I drew it on first. You'll see, so there, I'm dragging on the rectangle, the pattern, and then what I'll do is make sure I get coverage, and as I go over this, you'll see just a real light sculpt over the top of it so that I can get that scale pattern into the model. As long as you do this and you are careful, this stuff is only going to be positive. You get a nice render at the end, and the occlusion will really pop once you start working your texture. You won't have to do a whole lot of painting here. You'll see that once we get to the painting portion. Let's add sculpting out this hard surface model. I hope you enjoyed it. This has been Joe Pickup with SoMuchMonsters.com.